Hi, it's Dr. Crone. Welcome to our Snow Day lecture on state elections. This is for students who are missing class on Wednesday, February 20th because of the snow day. So here's what I want you to do. You'll need some kind of a blank document up ready to answer some questions. There'll be a couple times in the video when I have questions similar to the blue book type of writing that you usually do in class. When the question comes up, pause the video and write the answers into your document, and then you can restart the video. I also suggest keeping a copy of the slides pulled up because it's easier to look back on them than to try to review the video to answer the questions. Most of them are takeaways. And then after watching the video, if you want the extra credit points, you can submit your answers in a Word or a PDF document. There'll be a spot on Blackboard to do that listed as extra credit, Snow Day, February 20th. That submission will be 5 extra credit points, and you will also get class participation for Wednesday the 20th. If you don't get your if you do not submit this, you won't get class participation points for that day, for the snow day. And you need to turn it in, but you have over a week to do it. You need to turn it in by class time on Thursday the 28th. So you don't have to turn it in on the snow day. And the reason I'm having you do that is because we'll have the second part of the lecture, which is much shorter, on that Wednesday the 27th. And you'll need the information from this lecture because you'll be applying it in your group's in-class activity. So you really do need to be up to speed by that time. It's up to you whether you want to turn in the work or not, but whatever you do, I really strongly suggest you get this material covered in one way or another. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. So what I wanted you to just kind of introduce to you is that the reason that we study state elections in Polls 1250, the reason why it's important in studying state and local politics is not just because states elect state officials or mayors or city council members or the governor or things like that. It's more important than that because this is a state sovereignty, sort of a federalism issue. In the U.S. Constitution, in Article 1, Section 4, it specifically grants the power of setting the times, the places, and manner of elections. It grants that power to the states. So the U.S. government does not have sovereignty over when elections happen, how they happen. That is up to the states. Now, of course, the U.S. Constitution also guarantees the right to vote in the 15th Amendment. And so the Supreme Court has put some limits on the ability of the states to change elections because they have to make sure that each person has equal opportunity to vote. But other than that, other than constitutional issues, it's really up to the states on when and how they do their elections. And so states can really differ from each other, and that's something we're going to dive into when we do the in-class activity too, is you're going to be doing research on your own state. And we'll be covering the first 2 of these bullet points on this slide today, and then we'll have a short lecture that Wednesday the 27th where we will just hit the last 2 bullet points, which are very much related to each other. So for today, we're going to talk about how states can differ regarding state election laws. And then we're also going to talk about primary elections, which are elections to select a party's nominee, and how those differ among the states. Those can be very, very different. So first we'll start out with state election laws. And like I said, the right to vote to a citizen is guaranteed by the 15th Amendment, can't be stopped. But there are different states make different rules about the hoops you have to jump through in order to vote in a state, and what kind of electing is allowed. And those rules do affect turnout levels, or at least there's the potential for them to affect turnout levels. So speaking of turnout levels, this is the first time that I'm going to have you guys pause the video and answer these questions. You may remember them from last semester. If you don't remember them, you should be able to find them in a quick Google search. What percent of US voters approximately usually turn out for elections? What types of people are most likely to vote and what types are less likely to vote? And by type here, I mean demographics. So things like, well, I'm not going to give you any hints here, but we're talking about demographics. And then which party benefits from low turnout and which party benefits from higher turnout? So try to remember those. You should pause the video now and answer those questions in your document the best you can. I'm not looking for perfection here. And when you're ready, go ahead and move on to the next slide, or start the video again and we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, some of these slides will help you answer those questions if you didn't remember them. Also, we can briefly talk about them in class next Wednesday before we get started on the rest of the lecture. So as far as parties and voter turnout go, issues of whether to do things that could increase or decrease turnout, which a lot of these state election laws at least have the potential to do, these are partisan issues. And the reason those are partisan issues is because of the difference in for the Republicans and Democrats in whether they benefit or not from increasing voter turnout to types of people who don't normally vote. So with Republicans, one thing you might remember from when we talked about party identification is in general, there are fewer Republican party identifiers than there are Democrats in the United States. And Republicans have the most strength in the middle class and upper middle class, so people with higher income and higher education. We also know that those are the groups that generally do turn out. So the higher your education, the higher your income, the more likely you are to turn out to vote anyway. So for Republicans, they don't really benefit from making it a lot easier to vote because their core supporters are not people who are difficult to get to the polls. These are not people who generally have barriers in voting. So therefore, what we'll see in states is that Republicans often will be sort of pushing against having reforms that seriously increase turnout, particularly that increased turnout of the lower classes, the working classes. If we see that or at least the potential for that in an election reform, you're usually going to see the Republicans opposing that. On the other hand, the Democrats, there are more Democrats in the United States than Republicans, but Democrats tend to turn out at lower levels, and that's because the Democratic strength is in those people with less education and less income. And those groups, we think there's pretty good evidence that those groups are people who are the most likely to stay home, not vote, if it's more challenging to vote. So the harder it is, the more kind of roadblocks that are put in the way for citizens to vote, like, for example, registration requirements and things like that, the less likely Democratic supporters are to turn out, or at least that particular group of Democratic supporters who tend to have lower education and lower income. Therefore, when there's an election reform that seems to increase turnout, at least potentially increase turnout, or make it easier to turn out, Democrats are usually really behind it, whereas Republicans will often be opposing it. And vice versa with things that make it harder to turn out. If it's something that makes it harder, or at least the perception is it would be harder to turn out, you're going to find Republicans more likely to be supporting that, Democrats more likely to be opposing it. The other thing that gets very sticky when dealing with issues of laws that affect voter turnout is the terrible history, particularly in southern states, but also all over the United States, in suppressing the African American vote. And you know, the Martin Luther King's advocacy and the advocacy of other civil rights activists 100 years after the passage of the 15th Amendment, literally 100 years after the passage of the 15th Amendment, finally brought about the Voter Rights Act of the National Voter Rights Act, which required states to get rid of laws that suppressed African American vote. And what's difficult still today is that a lot of the states where there was the most discrimination and the most resistance to civil rights advocacy for registering Black voters or allowing Black voters to vote without intimidation or without a threat of violence, those states are the ones that there will often be opposition to Democratic suggestions for doing things that increase turnout or make it easier for people to vote. We'll talk about those. Making automatic registration, for example, or things like increasing the times and availability of early voting opportunities before Election Day. States with a history of discrimination, mostly the southern states, are ones where there's the most opposition to those kind of reforms. And that makes activists and people who are advocating for racial equality and for change in racial attitudes among people in the United States, that makes them very suspicious that something's going on with these laws that that reflects that history of discrimination, that they're not as neutral as they sound. And we will talk more about that as you guys are finding examples of your state and your state's laws. So let's talk about some of these and kind of put some flesh on the theories that I've been discussing here in terms of things that can change and make turnout either easier or more difficult for ordinary citizens in a state. And these are the 4 topics listed here that we're going to talk about. These are areas where states have been recently, meaning in the last 20 years or so, have been changing the way that they hold elections. They've been changing state laws about the time, place, and manner of elections with these kind of reforms. So let's look at them in turn. So automatic registration, you may remember back to our Polls 1100 discussion of why the US has a lower turnout than some of the European countries, and one of those is one of the reasons was that many other countries do not have voluntary turnout registration. They actually have automatic registration whenever a person has any kind of interaction with the government. So, for example, getting a driver's license or something like that. They're automatically registered to vote. And this is actually a very, very new topic, and no states had automatic registration before 2015, and now in the last 4 years, 16 states have enacted it. So there's a list of states. You may be able to see that many of them are states where the Democrats have more political power. And so again, there's that thing that automatic registration, it might increase turnout. That's going to make Democrats more interested in it to help with their, the amount of votes they can collect, and it's going to make Republicans more suspicious of it. There's not enough evidence yet, scholarly evidence, over whether these kind of things actually do increase turnout. Many states, it's the automatic registration for voters when a citizen goes to get or renew a driver's license. Some states have it literally automatic. Other states, often states will offer an opt-out. So they say, I can register you to vote. Do you want to register to vote right now? And if you say yes, they just go ahead and register you. If you say no, then they don't. And then other states with a broader idea, so for example, Massachusetts and Maryland, on this chart, whenever you have any contact with any state or local government. So for example, if you go to get health insurance under the Affordable Health Care Act, if you sign up for welfare benefits, if you are a disabled person who's signing up for disability or workers' comp or something like that, the states offer you or automatically register you, depending on the state, or at least offer you that option of registering right away, right there. So that's something that's changing, and like I said, we don't know exactly whether that would increase turnout, but this is a political issue which Democrats are going to favor, assuming that it will help them, and Republicans are probably going to push against. And already in some of these states, you see Republicans who don't like this bringing up the potential for fraud, the potential for somebody getting a driver's license who isn't a citizen, and then getting a fraudulent registration to vote. And some states have taken those more seriously, where like if you look at New Jersey or Washington State, the Secretary of State or someone in their the executive offices has to approve that registration. It's not automatic. It has to be approved and when checked to make sure the person is actually a citizen. So that's automatic registration. Some of you may notice that your state is on there. A longer standing and more controversy, I guess, has to do with voter identification laws. In other words, laws that require voters to show, to prove who they are, to show some kind of identification before they're allowed to vote, whether they're registered or not. The stated goal of this is to prevent election fraud, which I think we can all agree is a good thing. You have to prove that you are who you say you are when you go to vote. The types of voter identification laws vary from one state to another. So the strictest law is what's called a strict photo ID law, and that means that you must have an identification with a photo on it. In a few states, that actually is required to be a government-issued photo ID, whether that's a driver's license or a non-driver's identification card. So that would be the most strict. You couldn't use any other kind of photo identification. And when it says strict, it just means that if you don't have that with you at the polls, you are not allowed to cast a vote, or you may only cast what's called a provisional vote, which isn't going to get counted until after the election. Some states, Ohio's got a strict ID law, not a photo ID law, but some states will allow you to go downtown to vote later when you do have your ID with you. Like I said, Ohio also has a strict law, but we allow non-photo IDs. There are many examples. In Ohio, for example, you can bring a utility bill that's addressed to your address with your name and address on it. And as long as that matches your registration name and address, you can vote. It doesn't have to have a photograph on it, but it is a strict law. If you don't have it, you either have to go home and get the ID and bring it back, or you have to cast what's called a provisional ballot, which will only be counted after the election and in case they need a tiebreaker, basically. Some laws have requests rather than strict requirements. So some laws have a photo ID requested, but if you don't show it, they'll say something like, okay, well, this time we'll let you vote, but next time you won't be allowed to vote. It's more of a lax law. And some different states vary in terms of how they enforce that and sort of what the consequences are of not having an ID with you. But in general, in those states, you can still vote even if you don't have the ID with you. And then the least strict is an ID requested, photo not required, meaning you could have something like in Ohio, they would request it, but again, you wouldn't it wouldn't stop you from voting that particular time if you didn't have that with you. And then there are states that don't have any identification law at all, where all you have to do is say your name and sign your name. Probably your signature has to match what they have on the record. But other than that, they don't have, you don't have to show any form of identification. So you can kind of see from this chart that since 2000, there has been an increase in identification laws. And actually, I did look up for 2016, and it looks like it's continued to go up, but the number of strict laws has actually, percentage-wise, has gone down as more states have been adopting these. But you can kind of see it's the strict laws are the least likely. Only 10% of states in 2014 had a strict law, either photo or non-photo. But there has definitely been an increase. Before 2000, there were very few states that required identification at all. So when I first became a voter, and for many, many, many years as a voter in my adult life, you didn't have to bring an identification with you. So these laws, voter identification laws, are extremely controversial, and they've been around longer than the automatic registration laws, so we know more about the parties. The parties are more entrenched in their positions on being either for or against these. Republicans are for voter ID laws. Democrats, in general, are opposed to them. And the trouble with this controversy is that both sides have guilt and culpability in terms of exaggerating the evidence to try to make their case. So that's what I want to kind of step away from a little bit so that we can understand these parties' arguments. Republicans, again, they are happy with things that do not increase turnout, that make it slightly harder for people to vote. Not because they don't like people to vote, but because it affects their likelihood of winning if more people, especially more lower income African American, honestly, people are encouraged to vote. Or minorities are encouraged to vote, because that is, or enabled to vote, who haven't voted before, because that threatens the Republicans' ability to win elections in that state. So that's why they like these voter fraud laws or voter ID laws. Now, Republicans, in their arguments in favor of voter ID laws, emphasize the threat of voter fraud, and that is absolutely a potential. And most people, doesn't matter who you are or what class or race you are, most people don't want voters to be able to vote with fraudulently. So, on the face of it, their argument makes a lot of sense. However, there are a couple things that they tend to do when you look at the actual data. One of which is they really exaggerate the actual rates of in-person voter fraud. The actual rates of purposeful in-person voter fraud are extremely low, and by low, we're talking maybe one or two occurrences in one or two states every major election. So this isn't something that happens very often, and the Republicans like to sort of play with that data and exaggerate it. There is slightly more of often what's called voter fraud by people who are using it for a political reason, is really voter mistakes, and sort of places where people who thought that they were registered to vote or who thought that they were eligible to vote show up to vote, and when they're told, no, you actually can't vote, they say, oh my gosh, okay, sorry. Whereas that's different from, I think, what we would fear by voter fraud, or what most of us would be worried about, which would be somebody who knows they're not allowed to vote, deliberate voter fraud, someone who knows they're not allowed to vote, and shows up and says, I'm, Martha Crone, when they pretend to be me to take away my vote and go ahead and vote. And the actual rates of that are extremely, extremely low, and that's consistently measured across by scholars. And the other thing Republicans tend to do is minimize the potential detrimental impact that these laws could have on voters by saying things like it's easy to have a voter ID and everybody uses a driver's license and things like that. So that's the Republicans' party position, and as you can see, it's not particularly well supported by data. The Democrats, on the other hand, do the exact same thing, and the Democrats, when they're arguing against voter ID laws, their reasoning for that is that it suppresses the minority vote, that it keeps especially African Americans from being allowed to vote. African Americans who want to vote, it keeps them from being allowed to vote. And their reasoning for that, which is true, is that African Americans are less likely than white people to have government issued photo identification. The fault, so that that's concerning too to most people who say, hey, every citizen should have an equal opportunity to vote. The fault with the Democrats' argument is that they tend to exaggerate the effect of these ID laws on minority turnout. This has been studied by numerous scholars who study these things who can't find a suppressing effect. And the people who do find suppressing effects, it's not nearly as big as you might think it would be. It seems to be quite minuscule, actually. And the truth is that most ID laws do not require a government-issued photo ID. I think there's only 1 or 2 states that actually require that, which is the thing that people say African Americans generally have, fewer African Americans have, and that's actually true, fewer African Americans have them. But many ID laws will take a college identification or a school identification or some other kind of photo identification. So Democrats tend to exaggerate how many or the percentage of the vote that is suppressed by these laws, and they also tend to minimize the existence of voter fraud, which does exist. It's like we said, it's low, but it does exist, and often the Democrats will just push that aside and say, oh, there's no such thing. That does never happen, which isn't true. So it's very partisan, and I think you'll find as you research your state, if your state is a Republican-dominated state, you're more likely to have these laws, and this is the reason why. Okay, early voting in person. This is also controversial and also a partisan issue. And this is something that might increase turnout. I haven't seen enough evidence of this, but then again, I haven't really looked for evidence of this. So stay tuned on that one, whether it increases turnout or not. But the argument is that it can increase turnout. So early voting in person just basically means that some states actually open the polls, and by polls here, I don't mean opinion polls. I mean the polls in voting mean the actual place where you go to cast your vote. And some states have in-person polling places open before Election Day, including Ohio. In Ohio, there's, I think, 2 places you can vote in the weeks before the election. If you want to cast an early vote, you can actually show up at this place and cast your vote early if it's more convenient for you. Ohio, the reason that we have that law, though, is because the Supreme Court forced us to have that law, and that's because the 2004 presidential election, Ohio was a very bad example of, I think it was unintentional, but I hope it was unintentional, let's put it that way. Some of my colleagues don't agree with me about the unintentional part, but there were not enough polling places open. There weren't enough places to go to vote open in urban areas. Columbus had a problem with this, so did Cincinnati, so did Cleveland. And so especially in poor neighborhoods that were dominated by African Americans, urban neighborhoods, you saw incredibly long lines. There were people who waited in line, had to wait in line, literally the entire day to vote. and they turned voters away if they were in line at 7:30 when the polls closed. They just said, hey, we're closing, you can't vote, no matter how long they'd been in line or how long they'd been there. And the best estimates, the most neutral, politically neutral estimates are that 3% of potential voters were turned away on those days, and they all were from urban areas, and most of them, many of them, were African Americans. And so Ohio was actually the NAACP sued Ohio and won that suit, and Ohio was required to have early voting in person. Despite the fact that we're a Republican state, and generally speaking, Republicans don't like things that might potentially increase turnout, especially turnout of working class or lower class folks, and especially turnout of working or lower class African Americans. These laws at least are thought to increase turnout, and a lot of that has to do with the types of jobs that people in the working class and lower classes have. That idea that you have to have off on election day, excuse me, and you have to have your it's not a holiday, it's not a day when people typically have off work, and that the lower income type of job you have, the more likely you are to be prevented from voting that way. And so the theory, at least here, is that Democrats will benefit from early voting in person. And ever since 2005, when these reforms were forced upon Ohio, there have been arguments about how long to make early voting in person, with Democrats saying we need to make it longer, it should be 6 weeks, it should be open on the weekends, and Republicans trying to say, no, we're not going to open it on the weekends, it's only going to be open during business hours, that kind of thing. So we see again that this is controversial. Many states do have early voting in person, and it's much more common these days than it used to be. And finally, absentee voting laws. This is another way of making it easier for people to vote. The best research says this probably doesn't seem to increase turnout. Maybe that helps explain why Republicans really like absentee voting laws. So every state makes some kind of allowance for people who cannot be at the polling place on the day of the election to vote by mail. In other words, sometimes these are called mail voting or by mail. So different states have different regulations about it. The strictest regulation is excuse required for absentee voting. And this is true in Pennsylvania. It was true when I grew up, is that if you want to vote by mail because you can't be at the polling place on election day, you have to have a written excuse of why, like something to show that your work is requiring you to be out of town, or that you have a chronic illness or something like that. And that had to be filed ahead of time in order for you to get what they call an absentee ballot, a mail-in ballot. That's real strict, and some states still do have that. Ohio has what's called no excuse absentee voting, which means that anybody can ask to vote by mail. And you're allowed to you have to fill out a form to request an absentee ballot, and then it's mailed to you, and you fill it out at home whenever you want to, and you mail it in by a certain date, and your vote will be counted. And in Ohio, you don't need an excuse for that. Anybody can request one. There are some states, Colorado is one of them, I believe Washington State maybe, that have all mail voting, where literally this is the only way you can vote, and every registered voter is mailed a ballot, and everyone votes by mail. And there are also arguments in states about how early absentee ballots can be filed. Like how early can you request one? Some states say only, a month before. Some states make it a shorter time period. Some states make it a slightly longer time period. One thing that's coming up right now, and there's not enough evidence for me to feel good about saying for sure this happens, but this is a potential for fraud as well. And this is one that the Republicans generally don't focus on, voter fraud, but because you are doing it in the privacy of your own home, anybody who can forge a signature can steal someone's ballot out of their mailbox and fill it out for them and sign their name. Or people have been known to request absentee ballots for family members who are not capable of voting, like people who are extremely ill or something like that, and then fill it out for them. So that there is the potential for fraud in this as well. This typically benefits Republicans if it benefits anybody. Mostly what we think is people who vote absentee probably would have voted anyway, and this just makes it more convenient for them. But we know that probably does increase turnout a little bit, and that increased turnout is probably Republican, because it's probably about as difficult for a low education or low income voter to get an absentee ballot as it is to get registered, because it requires interacting with the government agency, knowing where to send the request, mailing it in, living in the same place so that you can get your ballot mailed to the same place that you mailed it from, and things like that. So this is kind of difficult. The good news for those of you, just because you're all high school students going to college, if anyone goes to college out of town or out of state, you can keep your voter registration at your home, and then request an absentee ballot and still be able to vote in the Ohio elections, and it's convenient for, say you even were in state, but you went to school at Bowling Green or Kent State or something like that, you could request an absentee ballot and then be able to vote that way without having to change your voter registration. All right, last thing we're going to do here for this is you're going to list one takeaway from each of the following topics. So pause the video here and go ahead and list one for each one of those and add that to your document that you've already started. And when you're ready, just start up the slides again. Okay, so now we're going to move away from state election laws and talk about primary elections. So primary elections are elections that happen within the political party to choose the political party's nominee for any particular office. Could be from the whole way from president on down to the mayor or city council members in your town. So every state holds primaries on at a particular time, and even in a time when we're selecting a presidential candidate, there's always lots of other party candidates on. So in some ways, primaries are like 50 separate elections, and in many cases, really, they're like 100 separate elections because there's a Democratic primary and a Republican primary in each state. And sometimes the Democratic Party primary and the Republican primary are actually held at different times. So that can be kind of confusing. States vary in when their primaries are held and what type of primary they have. So there's even more variation in primaries than there is in the general elections. There's really two types of elections or selection processes to make to find a candidate. So the one we're most familiar with, because it's the most common, is the primary election. And a primary election looks like a standard election. You show up to a polling place if you're a voter, you cast a vote in a voting machine, it's a secret vote, nobody knows what it is, and you're there with other voters, but you're not really interacting with them. You're doing your action is individual. A caucus, which happens in some states, Iowa is the most notable, but it does happen in other states as well. A caucus is, instead of a primary, a party can decide to have a caucus, which is a series of party meetings all over the state. And literally, these are like neighborhood level meetings. They're often held in a school, an elementary school in your neighborhood. And if you are a party member, you show up and what you do is debate among the candidates with the other members who are at this meeting. It's literally you vote with your feet. When you get there, they say, okay, everybody for Donald Trump over here in this group. And, you know, like, for example, in 2016, when there were a lot of people running against Donald Trump for the Republican nomination, if you're for Marco Rubio, come over here and stand in this group, come over here. And then they'd pick one person from their group to say why their candidate is the best and try and argue. It's almost like a debate. They try to argue why people should come over to their group. And then when all the groups have had a chance to do that, people can change the group if they want to. And until everybody's done and is satisfied with what group they're in, that's when they count the votes. And literally the votes are counted by the number of people in the group. These are very time consuming. They can go long into the night. You have to stay for the whole thing if you want to vote on all of the things. And they tend to be very low turnout, much lower than even standard primary turnout. And it's mostly just people who are very active in the party who want to come to these things. It's, you know, it's unlikely that sort of an average person would be like, oh, I want to show up for the caucus, just because it's a huge commitment of time. Unlike the primary election, which is just going to take you however long you have to stand in line and then go in and it's maybe 5 minutes till you cast your ballot and leave. But you'll find some of you will have states that have caucuses. So that's one way states can differ, whether they have a primary, whether they have a caucus. Another way they can differ is when their primaries happen. And in presidential years, states are always trying to rig the system to be very influential over the primary process. And the primary process is a long process. It starts in January and it runs through June. So it takes a long time to get through each state's primary till we know how all 50 states have voted. There are some traditions in here, but many of them are starting to go by the wayside. Generally speaking, Iowa and New Hampshire go first. Iowa has a caucus, New Hampshire has a primary, so New Hampshire is literally the first primary. Probably about 30 years ago, some states decided to cooperate together and have it was southern states decided to have their primary on the exact same day so that they could attract more candidates to come and campaign in their area. This was called Super Tuesday, and they also thought, hey, if the South votes as a block in a primary, then that's going to make us more influential. The most common right now is March. For primaries, that's when Ohio's is, but the trend keeps getting earlier and earlier. And a huge change in that is that California is moving their primary, at least considering moving their primary to February, which is a huge change because California has always been one of the last people, and they're sick of being so last that they don't have any influence. It's already kind of a done deal by that time. So just if you're interested, this is a map of the current sort of state of when primaries are going to be held. If it's a solid color, that means the state knows when it has already scheduled when their primary is going to be. If it's a stripe, that means that they're still negotiating or working with their state legislature. And if it's gray, that means they don't have a date yet, that they're still thinking about that. So that's just to interest you, and you will be looking up information about your state and when their primaries are held. The other way states can differ with primary elections is the type of primary, and these are very different. So there's open primaries, closed primaries, what's called hybrid primaries, that's what Ohio has, and then also a top two primary, which is extremely different than any of the other ones. So we'll start with an open primary. So open primaries are primaries where voters can wake up on the day of the election and decide which party's primary they're going to be part of, and they do not have to register with that party. And the party, the people who want to vote in that primary, they don't have to be registered with that party. A lot of states have open primaries these days. And that's a very big benefit to a voter because they can just decide which one they're more interested in. The problem with these is that the parties don't really like them. The problem is, or at least the potential problem is something called deliberate crossover voting, where let's say you're a dedicated Democrat, but what you really want is to mess up the Republicans. Instead of voting in the Democratic primary, you'd cross over and vote in the Republican primary. Maybe vote for the most wacky candidate or something. It doesn't happen as often as you might think, but there is a good documentation of it happening in 2012 in Michigan, because Barack Obama did not have any competition, so there was no presidential primary in the Democratic Party that year. And in Michigan, which has an open primary, a bunch of Democrats crossed over into the Republican primary to try to vote for this extremely conservative, very kind of out there candidate, because they were hoping that if that person became the nominee for the Republicans, that Obama would be more easily able to vote him. So there's some of that strategic thing that goes on. I'd say the parties worry about that more than it actually happens. One real thing is that because anybody can vote in it, the candidate who gets selected may not be somebody who represents their party well, may not be someone who the party workers who are going to have to get this person elected are proud or happy to work for. That happened to some extent with Donald Trump. He did very, very well in open primary states and less well in closed primary states. So a closed primary is basically just the opposite of an open primary. The only people who can vote in a closed primary are voters that have registered with that party before the election day. So if you think registration starts, is usually you have to be registered 30 days before an election in most states in order to be able to vote. In a closed primary state, you have to, if you want to, you can say, I'm registering with a party. You can say, I want to be a registered Democrat, I want to be a registered Republican, or I want to be a registered independent. And if you're an independent, as a registration, you're not allowed to vote in the primary at all. And if you're a Democrat, can you vote in the Democratic primary and vice versa. So the problems here is that basically voters have less say, they have less choice, but the party has way more control. And for voters, the biggest problem is that if you live in an area where, let's say the Republicans easily win all the congressional seats or all the state legislature seats, if that's the district you live in, then your vote in the primary, you have no choice. Whereas if you're in an open primary state and there's something like that, you could actually go vote in the Republican primary and have some say into who is going to become the candidate. Ohio has a hybrid system, and like that name implies, it's kind of a combination between a closed and an open system. So in Ohio, you do not have to pre-register with a party. You can decide which party's primary you want to vote for on the day of the election. However, that is equivalent in Ohio to registering with that party. So when you go and request a Republican ballot, you become a registered Republican. And then if you want to vote in the Democratic primary the next time around, you have to give up your Republican registration and re-register as a Democrat, which you can do on that day. And if you refuse to become a member of either party, to be registered with that party, then you're not going to be allowed to vote in the primary. So you have to be willing to say, yes, at least for today, I am a registered Republican. The idea is that gets rid of some of the crossover voting, that a true Democrat wouldn't really want to become a Republican just for that day. It is true that they do give your name and address to the parties, and then you get on the list that gets all of their information. Yeah, if you don't want to get junk mail from one of the parties, don't vote in the primaries. That is done basically to try to cut down on the amount of crossover voting. Yeah. And the final version of the primary is the top two primary, or what's called the runoff primary. And this is really, really, really different. This is one single election, not a Democratic election or a Republican election, but it's a single nonpartisan primary where anybody who wants to run for the office is all listed on the same ballot, and you vote for two. And then if no one gets a majority after that first vote, so if after all the voters vote for their top two choices and no one ends up with 50% of the votes, then the top two who are left face each other in what's called a runoff election. You have a runoff election maybe a month later or something like that. California has, they're one of the most well-known top two states. Louisiana has a top two. Parties really don't like these in general because they have no control, and they may actually end up with two Democrats running against each other or two Republicans running against each other in the general election. And so the opposite party from that is not happy with that. They also, it really heightens the inter-party conflicts where you're going to have like two Democrats running for governor and they're just at each other's throats, rather than getting this idea of let's all get behind one candidate against the party that we don't like. So those are all potential problems with that. They tend to happen in states where there's a history of one party being super dominant and the other party being really weak, which is true in California. That's generally speaking why they have them. But some people think that it's a good, some states want to have a nonpartisan primary and feel like it's good to have them all competing against each other. Okay, last chance. This is our last slide, so go ahead and pause the tape or the video, and I want you to create your own review quiz about primaries. So I want you to create 4 questions, one on each of the following topics, and include the answer. When you're all done with your document, again, save it as a Word or a PDF document and upload it under extra credit. It will be called Snow Day Makeup, Wednesday, February 20th. And I will see you in class on Monday for exam 1. We'll return to the topic of state elections on Wednesday, the 27th. Have a great one.